So, hi everyone, and welcome to this hangout with John Meyers today. He'll be talking about generating API built-in with Gatsby. So, hi John, how are you doing?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Fine, fine. Thanks for being here today. So, I will let you start with your presentation, and then we will take a question from the audience if there are any.
Awesome. Cool. So, hi, my name's John. Thanks for joining my talk on Gatsby. Originally, I titled this talk the Dynamic Site Generator, but I found out someone much more popular than me wrote a blog post with exactly the same name. And so I decided to rename mine Gatsby the Ephemeral API Generator, which I think sounds a little bit cooler anyway. Cool. So there are no kind of strict prerequisites for this talk. I guess it assumes some familiarity with React, which I guess is assumed for most of the talks coming through React Europe. But some nice to haves, I guess, would be if you had completed like the starter template or building a blog tutorial with Gatsby, and some familiarity, I guess, with GraphQL. There'll be a couple of GraphQL snippets. I'll explain what they're doing in case you're not familiar with them, but yeah, there would be some nice to haves. So what's covered in this? We're going to go through an overview of Gatsby. We're going to talk about what it is, what it's good for, and then we're going to look at building a blog. So we're going to be doing this statically. So we're going to be reading over a collection of Markdown files and creating our blog posts from that. That's a pretty standard way that Gatsby is used. We're then going to look at implementing favorites, which is going to be, it's going to require some dynamic behavior, as we don't actually know who the user is to be able to get their favorites at build time. So we need to make that request dynamically at runtime. Next, we're going to look at implementing courses. So we want to create some gated content where it's behind a paywall. And so we're going to look at a hybrid approach that can take some things from static, some things from dynamic. But yeah, it's basically the dynamic solution, but a little bit better. So let's have a look at a Gatsby overview. So by default, Gatsby will read over your pages directory, and any JavaScript files in there that contain React components will then be turned into static pages. So it'll create the HTML, CSS, JavaScript pages for you, and it will also configure the router. So you'll see here, I'm just going to localhost/hello world, and I'm getting that hello world message. So I haven't needed to set up any routing. It just knows if it's in my pages directory, it's going to read that component and create the static page for us. So what else can Gatsby do? Well, in the center here, we have this build step, which is sort of the real power of Gatsby. So this allows us to consume external data. So we can read through some Markdown files, YAML files, JSON files, or we could consume an additional or external API. So we could be consuming a GraphQL API or a REST API. And in this build step, the most common use case is that it will transform that data into static pages, build up static pages that can then be hosted on a static hosting service like Netlify or GitHub Pages or Zeitz Now or something like that. But the important thing to note is here in the deploy stage, we're deploying a static site, but that doesn't mean that the site itself can only be static HTML and CSS. So it also ships across all the functionality of JavaScript and also React. So once this application is actually running in the client's browser, we have the full benefits of an SPA. And yeah, so we can do things like request additional data at runtime. Cool, so let's look at building a blog. So we have decided that we are going to dominate this JavaScript industry. We're going to build the best damn blog in the world and really look at global domination of JavaScript blogs. So we're going to call it Empire. So we're going to first run Gatsby new to create a new Gatsby project, and we're going to call it Empire. We're then going to create a couple of folders. So under the source directory, we're going to create content and then blog. And in there, we're going to put a couple of Markdown files. So we're going to be looking at how to get it done. And then in case we made any mistakes, how to undo it for our 2 blog posts. This is an example of the how to get it done blog post. So At the top here, this might look a little bit unfamiliar. This is called front matter. So in Markdown, when we have dash, 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 and then a list of YAML looking key value pairs, and then another dash, dash, dash. These are basically variables that we can specify for in our Markdown file. And then at the bottom here, this is just the body of the blog. For all the examples in this talk, I've just kept it nice and simple with just titles. But this could have an ID or a slug for that particular blog, or keywords, tags, things like that. Anything that you would need to be dynamic. So then we're going to do what every good front-end developer does, and we're going to blindly install a bunch of packages that we don't understand that the blog post that we're following is telling us to install. And then to actually configure those plugins, we need to open up the Gatsby config file, and under module.exports, under the plugins key, I'm going to specify an array of plugins that we want to run. Here we're just using Gatsby source file system, which is going to read over our local files to read those Markdown files. We're telling it what path, so we're looking in source/content. So any Markdown files in that content folder or any subfolders are going to be read by Gatsby source file system, and then Gatsby plugin MDX is doing some magic with specifically Markdown files to give us some convenience functions in GraphQL that we can use later. So this is an example of what the GraphQL query might look like to pull out all of those blogs. So here we're using all MDX, which is what that Gatsby MDX plugin is doing for us. It might look a little bit weird with like edges, node, front matter. This might look a bit ugly if you haven't seen too much GraphQL previously, but really we're just trying to get an array of all of our blogs, and the only actual part of it that we care about is this title. So you can think of this as just an array of all of our titles of our blogs. We can then feed that into our blogs component. So at the bottom here, we have const blogs equals, and then we're passing in our our posts, and then we're mapping over all of those posts and rendering each post on the page, which is just destructuring the title out of that post and then rendering a card. So really we should just see a list of cards that have the titles of each of our blog posts. And yeah, sorry, the styling's gone a little bit weird there. Cool, so let's have a look at a demo of what this might look like. So here we have my Empire blog. You'll see that we've got a list of blogs, so how to undo it quickly and how to get it done. Obviously they should be the other way around, but let's not worry about that for now. And if we wanted to author a new blog post, we could just come to our blog folder, create a new React Europe.mdx. And then in our front matter, we could say the title is Hi React Europe. And we can have some content for our blog. And then if we go back to our page, you'll see that Hi React Europe appears there. So anytime we add a new Markdown file, it's rebuilding our Gatsby site. It's reading through all of those Markdown files, and then it's generating the static pages for us, which is a really, really awesome workflow. I think developers in general really like working with Markdown as opposed to interfacing with a CMS or something like that. Cool, but now we have a new feature request. We've become so popular. People are absolutely loving our blogs. They really want more. The problem is we're publishing so many fantastic blogs that it's hard to keep a track of all of them. So our users are now saying, I want a way to favorite the blogs that I really, really love, that I want to share with the world. I need a way to sort them because you're putting out too much good content. Cool. So for that, because we can't know a specific user's favorites at build time, we can't build a static page for every single individual user at build time because that user doesn't exist, and they might not even have registered for an account, so they might not even be one of our users yet. So in order to keep this kind of dynamic content, we're going to need to build an API separate from our application. So let's just imagine that an API exists where The endpoint for to get our favorites is API/getFavorites. We then pass it a user, and it's going to return us an array of favorites. So all of our favorites for this particular user. And then got another endpoint API/addFavorite. So this API endpoint is going to take in a user and a title. It's going to add that particular blog's title to that user's favorites, and then it's going to return us an array of favorites that contains that new favorited item, as in our updated version of the favorites. And then the remove favorite is going to do the inverse of that. So we pass it a user and a particular blog title, and we're going to get back again that updated version of the favorites once that favorite has been removed. Cool. So then, as I said previously, the Gatsby is an entirely dynamic single page application once it's in the client's browser. So we can make this GET request to API/getFavorites. We can pass across the user and then get back that user's list of favorites. And then we could just extend our component to, rather than just rendering the title, we're also going to render a star next to each one of those titles. And it's going to be filled in if that user has already favorited that item. And it's going to be transparent if it hasn't. If they haven't favorited it. And when we click that star, it's going to toggle whether that user has favorited that article. So toggle favorite, just to give you an example of what that function looks like, is just going to work out whether that, that current blog title is already favorited by that user. If it is favorited, it's going to call the remove favorites endpoint. And if it hasn't been favorited yet, it's going to call that add favorite. So we're just toggling whether that user has favorited that particular blog. And again, we make a post request to that URL, we pass across the user and the title, and we get back that array of favorites. Cool. So let's look at a demo, because that sounded overly complicated, but really all we were doing, if I just quickly uncomment some code, all we were doing is building the feature for this ability to favorite a blog. So if we click one of these stars, it takes a little bit of time because it's actually going over to the API, writing a record to the database, and then coming back with that new list of favorites. So it takes a little bit of time when we click to actually see that, but we could, fix that, I guess, with an optimistic UI or something like that, where we just assume that it's going to be okay and just swap that state. But for now, we're just keeping it in sync with the API and the database. So when I click, we see that that's favorited. I can favorite all of these, or I can only favorite one, whatever I would like. Cool, but the important part to note here is when I refresh, we see all of that other content that was static before and is already ready to render. And then we just see those stars appear later. And so we're still benefiting from the power of that static site generator, where we're generating the static content, showing it to the user straight away. And then anything that's dynamic can be triggered once the user has loaded that application in the browser. We can send off requests to other APIs, other services, whatever we would like to do dynamically. And then once that data is actually ready to present, just update the UI with that data. So again, if we refresh, see that content, and then the stars come in. Cool. So we now have a new feature request. We have been absolutely killing it in the game. We are ready to be a JavaScript mogul. So we would like to take our massive audience that we have been delivering heaps of great free content to, and we've decided we're going to build some courses, but these courses are just going to be so good, and our status is so high now that we are going to charge for these courses, and we're going to put them behind a paywall. So let's have a bit of a brainstorm about how we might be able to achieve this. So we could use, we're going to need this to be dynamic, right? Because we need to make sure that that user is allowed to view that course content. So we're going to have to gate that content somehow. We're going to have to put it behind a paywall or an authentication flow. So one option is we could use the same API setup as the favorites. So the benefits here would be we would have that gated content. We could write our authorization rules in our API, and enforce that no one has access to that content who shouldn't have access to that content. The downsides of this means we're maintaining an API. So we're going to have to build some kind of tool to interface with that API to write new blogs. And we probably need to build like a CMS or something like that to interface with that. It also means that we're going to have different sources of truth. So we'll have our main source of truth for our public blog content is going to be in our Markdown files co-located with our project, whereas our course content is now going to be the final source of truth of that is in the API or in the database that the API is abstracting. So that's not a great workflow, having to kind of work in two different places for content for the same website, just based on whether it's public or private. Also, a problem is REST APIs aren't cool anymore. Like, what other options do we have? Because everyone's saying REST isn't cool. Well, Markdown files are pretty cool. So if we were to find a way to write this in Markdown files, what would be the benefits that we get? We get the benefit that Markdown is cool. It's an awesome workflow, as we saw before. It's consistent with our current blog workflow. So we would be kind of authoring content in the same way, regardless of whether it's public content or private content. And something that we get for free in that kind of setup is it's actually versioned with Git. So because we're using Git commits and pushing up to GitHub to trigger our Gatsby build step to rebuild a version of our blog or of our Empire website, we actually can version control our content the same way we can features for our application. So we can roll back in time if we decide that we don't want a particular blog to go out live, or if we've accidentally deleted something, we have that full history that we can roll back to, which is really nice. Downside though is everything would be public if we were doing this in Markdown files. So that kind of breaks our rule of becoming a JavaScript mogul. How are we going to do that if we can't actually force people to pay for our content? So let's just imagine a world where we could have a hybrid of those two things. So what if we could have the API handle those authorization rules, but still be able to write the course content in Markdown? What if we could use Gatsby's build phase to populate our database so that we don't actually have to interface with that database manually? And then what if the database didn't need to be the final single source of truth? What if that database was just temporary? What if it was ephemeral and it only needed to exist as a convenience for consuming it on the front end, but we don't need to worry about it when we're developing content on the build side of things? So what would we get out of this hybrid approach? We would get our gated content, which is good. We'd get Markdown because Markdown is cool. We would get an awesome workflow that's consistent with our blog, and everything would be versioned with Git. So we could easily roll back if we did make a mistake. So as ugly as sequence diagrams are, I think it's a good way to communicate this flow. So imagine we had a writer here on the left, and our writer is like a course content creator or something like that. So they want to author a new course or a new lesson within a course. So they're going to create a new Markdown file, and they're going to populate it with that course content. When they're happy with that and they're ready for it to go live, they're going to commit and push it up to GitHub, which is going to trigger a Gatsby build. So the build step is going to look over that whole directory of Markdown files. It's going to transform all of those Markdown files into a JSON structure, so into an array of course objects, I guess. And then it's going to send the courses.json across to the API. And then the API is going to say, hey, database, I know this seems like a really, really bad idea, but just delete all the courses. It'll be fine. Trust me, we'll be good. The database goes, I don't know, API, you haven't told me to do that in the past. It doesn't seem like something you would expose to the outside world. And the API is like, don't worry about it, man. I got you. And so the database trusts the API and deletes all the courses. And then the API is like, see, I came through. Here's your new courses.json. Go and create all your new courses and everything will be fine. And the database says, thank you, API. You really looked out for me. So then what does that look like if we're requesting courses? So the user navigates to our Empire app and they say, yo, show me those sweet courses. The Empire application then makes a request to the API passing across that user and says, I want to get these courses. The API then checks, is the user actually valid and are they allowed to see these courses? If that's all good, then the API says, yo, give me those courses to the DB, and the DB says, here are those courses in nice JSON format, which it then forwards on to the Empire application, and the Empire application gives those to the user and says, look at those sweet courses. So a pretty similar workflow, I guess, to the favorites. So yeah, we can benefit from all of that API authorization magic with this setup. All right, I'm sold. So how are we going to do this? Firstly, we need to create a new directory in our content folder, which is going to be courses. And we're going to put an introduction to Gatsby.mdx file in that directory. We're then going to need a place to actually to tell Gatsby to send this data off to the API to be able to write it to the database. So this create pages function is exposed by Gatsby in the Gatsby node.js file. And this is a function that we can use to read over our local content, or we can make requests to other APIs, anything like that. So this is usually where we would dynamically create our pages at build time, and how we would create that static content. But this is just a node process, right? This is just a node script that's running at the time when our build runs. And so what else could we do with this node file? Well, I mean, we can do anything that node can do. So why don't we make a GraphQL request within the create pages function for all of our courses? And here, this looks a little bit ugly, but we're just filtering all of the Markdown files that we get back down to anything that matches /courses/. So really, we're just filtering out the blog content from all of our Markdown files. So we just get back the Markdown that's associated to our courses. Again, we're just pulling out the title from that. And there's a little bit of transforming magic that's missing between these two steps, but really we're just going to take that array of courses and we're going to send it off to our API and tell it to set the courses to this JSON array of courses that we have. Cool. So let's look at a demo of that. So here we have our Empire application, and then I bet you were wondering, what is that login button? That must be doing something magical. I wish he would just click it and I could find out. So here I'm going to click it, and you'll see we get this loading here, because what's happening is when we actually log in, we are triggering a request to the API to get the courses for this specific user. So again, if I log out, we don't see those courses, so we can't access those courses from the API if we're not logged in. But when we log in, it triggers a fetch to go and get those courses and display them to the user. And what does that look like from a content authoring standpoint? If we come across here and look at content, we have this blog folder, which is where we're writing our blogs, and then we have our courses folder, which is where we're writing our course Markdown files. So if we just copy and paste that one, and we'll just rename it React Europe is cool, and then we will add a title for React Europe is cool, and we'll just add some demo stuff that doesn't really matter. Cool, so we've now created a new Markdown file. And so if we navigate back to our application and we refresh, so when we first come to the page, we're not logged in, we sign in, and it's going to make a request to the API, and you'll see we've got that React Europe is cool course there now. So the authoring experience is really smooth. It's very similar to the authoring experience for our blogs. But we're getting all of that, the benefits of our authorization logic. So when we log out, they can't actually see that content. Whoops. Cool. All right, so in summary, we looked at building a blog statically, so taking those static Markdown files and building up the static blog pages at build time. We then introduced favorites, which required us to do some dynamic fetching at runtime. And then we looked at kind of building a hybrid approach where we benefited from the authorization side of that dynamic content, but then we're able to stick more with that authoring experience of the static content. So what's next? I reckon this build step is really, really powerful. I think that so far it is mostly used for consuming data and then building static assets. But I think that this has the potential to do some really, really innovative, interesting things. Another thing to note is this isn't actually limited to just Gatsby. I guess I'm a little bit of a Gatsby fanboy. In fact, if my camera was on, you could see that I'm wearing Gatsby pajamas right now because it is 7 a.m. in Australia, where I'm presenting this from. But this is not limited to Gatsby. So this is really possible in any system that has a build process that's responsible for building some static content. So yeah, thank you for watching my talk on Gatsby and building ephemeral APIs at build time. Did anyone have any questions?
Thanks. It was great. It was a great talk. I think we all want to see your Gatsby pajama right now. No, just kidding.
I was going to turn on the camera, but it'll take some setup and things might go wrong. So just trust me.
Okay. Well, do you recommend using any CMS for fetching data from APIs like Netlify or Amplify or stuff like this?
Yeah, I've used Netlify CMS in the past, which really makes authoring that content really nice for people that I guess are not as developer as happy with Markdown as developers. So Netlify CMS is a fantastic CMS for allowing other people more of that kind of, I guess, WordPress-like flow of authoring content without needing to understand Markdown, which is nice.
There are a lot of people that use it with WordPress actually, so I guess that works
so
also.
headless. Yeah, totally.
And do you always use it with your own server code, or do you use or do you plug it in hosted services a lot, or mostly your own code?
Yeah, so I guess you can use it with any API. I guess with the overriding side of this, I guess you would probably, I don't think many APIs would exist that just expose the ability to trash the entire database and rebuild it from a JSON file. So I guess that part is probably going to be custom built for you. But yeah, all of interfacing with any other tool, whether that be an API for data stuff or interfacing with Stripe for payments or something like that. This is totally possible with Gatsby.
Okay. And are there any plugins that you consider to be must-have with Gatsby that you always install?
Anytime I'm dealing with Markdown, that MDX plugin is really, really, really nice. It does some really nice, it exposes some really nice convenience ways of querying that data in GraphQL. There are some really interesting ones around like Google Fonts, making it so that you can fetch Google Fonts at build time.
Nice.
And not have those kinds of flashes going in dynamically fetching a font. But yeah, the plugin ecosystem for Gatsby is incredible. You can do so much. It's kind of like, I guess, that same kind of workflow as WordPress, where anytime you have some kind of problem you're trying to solve, it's probably a problem that has been solved by someone else before, and there's probably a plugin that you can pull in and do a lot of the heavy lifting for you.
Yeah, I've been using Gatsby Image, and it's pretty nice because it resized all the images at build time.
Yeah, that is another fantastic plugin.
And even if you use remote images from your API, it fetches them and then resizes them and does all this for you. So that's
yeah,
nice.
Doing the amazing, like loading a low quality version of it and then like a blurry version and then swapping it out for the high quality version is, yeah, it makes working with images incredible.
Okay, and do you use it mostly to build hybrid app with both static and dynamic, or do you use it mostly for static websites?
Yeah, so the use case for this talk came from a platform that I was building called Monoglot, which means you only speak one language, and so it's a blog or platform only for JavaScript, the one language JavaScript. So monoglot.dev is a website that I've built, which has the blog side of this talk, but the courses side is something that I'm working on at the moment. So yeah, I have previously built an LMS that used this this process for gating that content. So it's kind of a hybrid of two systems that I've worked on in the past. But I think ever since I discovered Gatsby, I found it really, really awesome for those kinds of public use cases, but found it really difficult to find good resources on how to deal with that kind of gated, authorized content. And a lot of the examples that I saw were just about consuming it at runtime because it is a dynamic application. But yeah, I really wanted to be able to author that content in the same way because the kind of authoring flow, working with Markdown files was just so smooth to me, and all of the other benefits of Git and things like that. Yeah, I kind of spent a long time trying to think of ways that this could be done.
Okay. There's a question from the comments. There's someone asking if the demo is available on GitHub. Is it? Do you have a link? Or
it is not yet. I'll put up a link after this, and I will tweet it out. I guess if you want to follow me at @_DijonMusters, I will put out a link for the live version of this and the GitHub repo.
Okay, we will retweet it whenever it goes out. And there's another question. There is a bit generic, I guess. It's asking, why are you using this platform?
Why am I using this platform? I really, really like Gatsby because it follows the pattern of the pit of success, and so it gives you a lot of the defaults are sensible defaults and very performant defaults. And if you want to do non-performant things, you usually have to implement that yourself. And so by kind of giving you the most easy way to do something being the most performant, kind of most likely to succeed way, I think is a really awesome pattern to follow. So give people really powerful tools by default, and then allow them to write bad code to break it.
Okay. And do you think more plugins should be shipped by default included? I think there are a few people who complain about this, that they always have to install the same plugins. Do you think it should ship with more plugins enabled by default, or are you fine with the current setup, with the current default setup?
I personally think it's really nice that you have that really thriving community of plugins completely separate from that main Gatsby tool. I like the idea of because it is kind of built to be quite performant and fast, not kind of bogging it down with a whole bunch of plugins that you might not actually use or understand how to use, or even know that are there. So I think it's nice that it ships fairly slimline, and then allows you to kind of compose all of those other bits using themes or using plugins to compose the solution that you need, rather than kind of giving you an out of the box solution to everything when you're only using a very small slice of it. And I think some of the starter templates and Gatsby themes kind of address that issue. If you have a specific problem you're trying to solve, like you can run from Gatsby new, you can provide it a template. So you can give it the blog template, for example, and it will do a lot of the markdown part that we saw in the first part of this talk for you. So you'll have an application that already solves that problem of building a blog.
Okay, makes sense. Well, I think that's it for questions. Do you have anything you would like to say before we leave?
I don't think so. Just, I hope someone is inspired to go and build some cool stuff that hasn't been built utilizing this build step in Gatsby. And you should come and follow me on Twitter, because I have a lonely 6 followers at the moment.
Oh, wow.
And it would be great to get some more followers.
Well, do you promise that you will do something special if you reach like 10 followers?
Absolutely.
Like, what can you promise us?
What can I promise you? If I reach, let's set the bar low. If I reach 100 followers, I will build a Gatsby theme or a Gatsby plugin that does some of this stuff for you.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, open source it.
Okay, deal. All right. Well, thanks, John, and for everyone watching, don't hesitate to subscribe by clicking on the subscribe button. And tomorrow we'll have another live stream with Meyers from Datadog. He's also the maintainer of Yarn too, so make sure to watch tomorrow also. Okay, thanks and cheers.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.